A nonprofit group that marks historical sites in Rhode Island has now made its mark on Newports.
Rhode Island Slave History Medallions installed a medallion on Bowen's Wharf to give Rhode Islanders and visitors alike a strong reminder of our past.
The group Rhode Island Slave History Medallions held a ceremony to unveil a new medallion on Bowen's Wharf, simply reading Rhode Island Slave History.
We want to tell these stories so that people in the future can know our true history.
Chairman Charles Roberts says the medallion is to acknowledge Newport's role as an integral part of the triangular slave trade, where slavery was a large part of the state and country's economics.
This is where the rum was made. The rum was made from sugar. The ships from here that were financed and banked by some of the most well-known names in history left here, went to Africa, traded their rum for slaves.
The artwork was inspired by the work of Pompey Stevens, his work known to be among the first signed African artwork in the United States.
I'm just happy to have helped to realize Pompey Stevens' style and his form. Honored to have helped with the artwork that was necessary.
The medallion also contains a QR code taking you to the Rhode Island Slave History website to learn even more. Many Rhode Islanders were in attendance at the unveiling, including Fern Lima, who says it's about time. She says her great-grandparents were slaves here.
My grandparents in Newport were the Matthews family. They came up here to work in the mansions when they were youngsters and stayed married. You go to school, they never talked anything about the black history. But it's nice now. Different places we go, people are opening up a little bit and the stories are coming out, and I hope they just continue.
Behind me is Linden Place Mansion. It's a federal-style home built in 1810 by George DeWolf. George and Charlotte DeWolf both came from very prominent, wealthy families here in Bristol. George was very much a wheeler, dealer, opportunist here in town in terms of business. We always like to think of the northern states being sort of the liberators, the ones who sort of worked against slavery, the abolitionist societies, when in reality, the transatlantic slave trade involved every bit of the Rhode Island economy in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The DeWolf family owned many ships, and they also owned the town banks. They would take these ships, they would load them up with rum, which was made here in Bristol, and they would sail to Africa, specifically Ghana, what they called the Gold Coast. And they would take that rum and they would trade for enslaved peoples to be brought on their ships to plantations in Cuba. It was a very brutal journey. Rum was in very high demand. Rhode Island rum in particular was very sought after. This was a huge moneymaker for the DeWolf family.
You've heard the anti-Semitic tropes. Jews run the banks, Jews manipulate space lasers, Jews pull the strings and make world leaders dance. But have you heard that Jews controlled the slave trade? This libelous claim began circulating in 1991 when an extremist organization known as the Nation of Islam claimed to have gathered irrefutable evidence that Jews ran the slave trade in the Americas. Most recently, the claim reared its ugly head when NBA star Kyrie Irving promoted the film Hebrews to Negroes, which makes some pretty outlandish allegations about the Jewish role in the slave trade. So let's ask the uncomfortable question. What role did Jews play in the transatlantic slave trade?
The red are the executives that are Jewish.
If you were a rich white southerner who could afford to own slaves, you likely did. And that included the small Jewish community of the 19th century American South. Jews owning slaves? We are talking about the same community that celebrates their own liberation from slavery every Passover, right? The same nation that gave the world the classic line,
"Let my people go."
It's a strange and brutal irony, but it's true. Sure, census data suggests that Jews enslaved far fewer folks than your average white Christian southerner.
What he said?
Nigga, please.
Nigga, please.
Nigga, please.
I mean, roughly 12,000 Southerners enslaved more than 50 people. Want to guess how many of that number were Jews? 20. So to claim that Jews had some kind of monopoly on slaveholding is, well, pretty ridiculous.
These new immigrants came north with lucrative trade connections. As a result, some of the most prominent people in colonial Newport were Jewish, such as Aaron Lopez, for a time in the mid-18th century, the city's wealthiest merchant.
Man, so I've seen several times in the comment section where people are talking about, they'll post a question, oh, so who you think owned the slave ships?
Good question.
I'm like, who? Yeah, good question. Who,
We
who
don't
owned
know.
the slave? Who owned
Right.
the slave ship? It does not really talk about that a lot. And the more and more you dig into history, the more and more things are unraveled.
And yet, the fact remains that some Jews did enslave kidnapped Africans. The stats are even starker when you head over to the Caribbean and South America, where Jews were just as likely as their non-Jewish neighbors to own an enslaved person. It's an uncomfortable legacy to grapple with, to be sure. But it wasn't an unusual one. Jews were not disproportionately more likely to own enslaved people. And they certainly were not more likely to, how does the Nation of Islam say it, control the entire slave trade? Yeah, no. Where does this lie even come from? Well, I don't want to say anything too controversial here, but I think it's safe to say that Jews living in 18th century Europe weren't doing too great.
The Jews of Newport, when they arrived, primarily people, and they had contacts all over the world because of the fact that they had been running from country to country. And thus they became very prosperous in Newport. They were able to bring in goods that were never here before.
Centuries of restrictive anti-Semitic legislation left them with few options for making a living. Barred from owning land in many professions, Jews turned to the few trades they were allowed to practice: commerce, supply, trade, manufacturing, and finance.
God have mercy upon us.
Behold the origin of the old anti-Semitic stereotype that Jews are good with money or control the economy. Now, Portugal and the Netherlands were once home to two of Europe's large Jewish communities. And what kind of trade were Portugal and the Netherlands doing in the 18th century? You guessed it, importing and exporting human beings.
I say, hold up, wait a minute.
It's not looking good, bruv. It's not looking good.
Since Portuguese and Dutch Jews were traders and merchants and businessmen, some made their living trading enslaved people. While a few were prominent slave traders, most found themselves in minor roles as middlemen.
Okay. Aaron Lopez, a prominent Jewish merchant, was one of the largest slave traders in North America and owned several ships that transported enslaved Africans from Africa to America.
And what was so unique when I saw that, Joy, Aaron Lopez?
Did not know that.
Lopez sounds like a Hispanic Latino name. Lopez? And he was Jewish? That was weird to me.
What is your good name?
My name is Motherfucker.
Well, your name is what?
Motherfucker.
Please, your name is what again?
Motherfucker.
Who gave you that name?
My father and mine.
Then ask for any song and we play it for you.
No, I don't want any song, but let me receive my phone first.
Aaron Lopez was known as the Prince Merchant of Newport. Apparently, he was one of the wealthiest people in all of Newport at the time. He and his many other Spanish immigrants had lived as conversos. And when he came to Newport, he felt so comfortable and free that he went back to his Hebrew name, Aaron.
Brokering arrangements for enslaved people, among other commercial goods. Others became minority investors in much larger slavery-based businesses. Meanwhile, Jews in the Caribbean relied on the trade of European goods, food products, and diamonds, since they already had networks for those types of merchandise.
I have no idea what I'm doing, but I know I'm doing it really, really well.
A tiny number owned slaving vessels or resold enslaved people. In terms of Dutch international trade, Jews were already disproportionately represented, and unfortunately, the number of Jews involved in the slave trade reflects this. It's estimated that Jews were responsible for 6 to 10% of Dutch slave trade to the Americas.
Why the fuck you lying? Why you always lying? Oh my god, stop fucking lying. Always lying to me. You lying so much. You making it hard for me.
As a Jew, I'm embarrassed by such a high number. But the Dutch slave trade only accounted for roughly 6% of a trade dominated by the British and Portuguese.
Why you always lying? Why you always lying? Hubbly bubbly homo stop lying.
In terms of British involvement in the slave trade, scholars estimate that roughly a dozen Jews participated in some aspect of the transatlantic slave trade. A dozen. Put it all together, and it's still nowhere near what anti-Semites are claiming.
people here are called anti-Semitic.
Yep.
What is your response to that as an Israeli Jew?
Well, it's a trick. We always use it. Woo! When from Europe somebody is criticizing Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in this country people are criticizing Israel, then they are anti-Semitic. And the organization is strong and has a lot of money.
That lady is not a random person, guys. She was a former Israeli minister, okay? Her name is in the video. I'll put it so you guys can see it, okay? She's telling you right there that that word anti-Semitic, it's a trick. When they use it, this is what they are actually doing here, guys. They want to elicit an emotional response from the masses, which can be directed against that individual who is criticizing them, forcing him into either silence or a loss of status in society, business or politics, okay? That word, that label, anti-Semitic, is meant to disempower a person, guys, to weaken him. And many of us were so simple, we actually do what these Khazars want, okay? We actually fall for it. When we hear someone is anti-Semitic, we start to treat that person as if he has leprosy. No, okay, it's not true. Okay, it's not true. They only use that word on people who are investigative, who are curious, who are opposing their agenda. It's very important that you understand that that word, that label, anti-Semitic, is a weapon, a trick. They always use it.
And by the 19th century, the already minor Jewish share of the triangular trade had all but disappeared. As a descendant of enslaved peoples in the Caribbean,
We live in an incredibly interesting country. Constitutionally, our constitution is celebrated as one of the most progressive and one of the most human rights-based constitutions in the world.
There are over 110 synagogues in South Africa. We have 56 schools, so there's a real vibrancy of life. Over 90% of South African youth attend a Jewish day school, so they're coming out from school with a very good Jewish education and a very good Zionist education.
We as Jews live a very full and meaningful life with almost no active sense of any prejudice against anybody.
that is what we call a lie.
A few moments later.
We also live in a country where historically our government, which is the ruling party, which is the African National Congress, have a deep and meaningful history with the Palestinian Authority. It's a complex history that we as a community constantly confront when it comes to dealing with matters around Israel. And when I say Israel, we perfectly understand that the South African ruling party are deeply sympathetic with the Palestinians. What we as the Board of Deputies remain vigilant about is that that support for the Palestinians doesn't spill over and become anti-Israel. Minister of Trade was motivated by an anti-Israel, we won't call them pro-Palestine, anti-Israel lobby group to label these products as manufactured in Israeli-occupied territories or Israeli-occupied Palestine, or more recently the suggestion was in illegal Israeli settlements. So it became a really, really tough year for us. So 2012, a large part of our anxiety was around the issue of this labeling.
The one point that I would like to make with the whole issue of boycotts, divestments and sanctions, it's a very, very difficult topic, and particularly for us in South Africa, because we come from a context where boycotts and sanctions did work in terms of overthrowing the apartheid government. And it makes it very difficult for us to engage and to argue that it's not a constructive way of going forward, and it doesn't actually bring long-term results to an environment. And we try very hard to argue with our government, saying rather than bringing in these punitive measures, rather let's try and facilitate dialogue between the parties so that they can come to some form of resolution. But again, for us as South Africans, where it has worked, it is difficult. And we remember, of course, from our own history how devastating that was when you start getting cut off and you start getting isolated.
And you start to feel, you start to feel awkward about identifying as a citizen of the country. I remember growing up in South Africa and pretending when you're in New York that you're actually Australian or something else.
Yeah.
And the thought that that might happen for us Jews in terms of our commitment and love for Israel is deeply worrying.
I'm not here to downplay the role of any group or individual. Slavery and the vicious brutality of the transatlantic slave trade was evil, period. Just because it was widely accepted in the culture of the time doesn't make it any less wrong. To claim that Jews played a leading role in the slave trade is to play into the same old trope that anti-Semites have been spewing for centuries. That Jews are part of some conspiracy to run the world. That Jews wield power wildly disproportionate to their population.
They have power, money, and media and other things.
That is what we call a lie. Jews are money-hungry monsters who profit off of others' suffering. It's easy to manipulate facts to form a certain narrative, to cherry-pick data, pluck statistics out of context, and weave it all into some warped story about Jewish evil. Half-truths are powerful precisely because of the tiny kernel of truth buried within them. But this isn't even a half-truth, it's a bald-faced lie.
מעולה, מעולה, מעולה. כמו שניתן לראות, אלה הבלתי מעורבים היחידים בעזה, אנחנו שומרים עליהם. איזה נוח. תודה לך מוחמד. בבקשה לך אחמד. תודה אחמד. תהנה.
תשע, שמונה, שבע, שש. פסל תקי. יופי, תראה את החיבור. מי ניצח שמה? מי ניצח?
That is what we call a lie. Did some Jews own enslaved people? Yes. Did some Jews benefit from the labor of enslaved people? Yes. Did some Jews work trading in human beings? Yes. Does any of that mean that Jews controlled the slave trade? That they benefited disproportionately from buying and selling their fellow human beings? That they were primarily responsible for hundreds of years of misery and suffering and theft? Absolutely not.
Hey guys, if you want to watch more clips, click here.
And if you want to watch the full podcast, click right here.